What's up guys, the Strong Boys 19 here. This is going to be another albums list video for you guys. Before I'm going to dive into it, I just want to make this video completely free from editing it at all. I'm just going to make this uncut and not use my video editing software like I would normally do for my videos, because if you guys have seen a post that I did create on my channel's community page, from my Joey Jordison video, it has been the worst, most extremely stressful experience to get a video like that done. The flaws were that the software was slowing my laptop completely down, lots of lagging. Sometimes there were moments of it completely crashing and I had to keep saving the file of whatever video it is. I have to close it down and reopen it just to continue the editing. So obviously you will not see any image of an album for this video, but I hope you guys will just accept this type of video for the way it is. So with that being said guys, this is going to be my list of my top 10 favourite double albums of all time. Now, I would have been selecting very obvious picks, but some of them are in this list. There are going to be some that you may not agree with me on, but there will be some surprises. For those of you who would be surprised to see an album that you either don't like or love, that is on this list. The honourable mention albums, the ones that didn't make it to my list, are going to be Yes's Tales from Topographic Oceans, The Mothers of Invention's Uncle Meat, The Who's Tommy, Smashing Pumpkins' Melancholy and the Infinite Sadness, and the last one is going to be Iron Maiden's The X Factor. And also Lou Reed's Metal Machine Music. I almost forgot to mention that album. But these top 10 albums are the ones I love the most. I'm going to put timestamps on each part that I'm going to talk about the albums that are in this list. So let's get started. It's going to be my personal opinion, and if you want to share yours, please put it in the comment section below. Now, with that long introduction out of the way, let's get on with it. At number 10, I have Captain Beefheart's Trout Mask Replica. This is the most divided album ever created. But unlike Metal Machine Music, Trout Mask Replica is another one where a lot of music fans have their own reactions with it, to either be really positive and be intrigued by it, or others that would completely hate it and dismiss it entirely. This is one of those albums that took me the longest amount of listenings to understand why it was made in this very intentional way. Captain Beefheart, along with others like Frank Zappa, is completely not for everybody. But the more I understood the premise and the whole origin to create this album in the first place, and with what Captain Beefheart wanted to achieve here, I got it. I love this album because it's not only challenging and so over the top, but there is that monstrous blend of not only this frantic, completely in-your-face, sloppy, messily balanced pieces of material, but the influences are strong on this album, as obviously before Trout Mask Replica, Captain Beefheart and the Magic Band were into the blues music scenes and some pieces of psychedelia, like what they did on Safe as Milk and Strictly Personal. And it is presentable on this album as well, but there's other pieces of music concrete to avant-garde, and Coltrane was at this time being very inspired by John Coltrane, so there was this jazz mentality, from his own take on things. It's completely insane to me that this album was made without any lessons or knowledge at all to compose this album's material on the piano. Beefheart was not a pianist at all, so it was completely an unskilled idea, but it just took, for me, a long time to really digest things. It's completely out there. It's full of this craziness of stream of consciousness, lyrics, and poetry, and all these other elements that have been combined into this gigantic, I would say, as unique and artistic documentation of music history. I have done an album review of this album for Classic Albums Revisited when I started reviewing albums for that segment. So Trap-Mask Replica is one album that is not for everybody, and if you are really interested to know what it is, I would say look up a lot of information about this album for yourselves before you listen to it for the very first time, because it is not for all of everybody's eardrums. At number 9, I have the Beatles' White Album. Now, I absolutely think that this is where, in my opinion, the Beatles were making their first time experiences of writing their own material completely separately, as if it's like an album of separate Beatles solo material efforts, but to still call it as the Beatles. I know there's a lot of tracks that it's all of the Fab Four recording and working together, but there's a ton of these tracks that could be, you know, each of the members' early beginnings of solo album material, just like what George Harrison had to deal with, that the rest of the Beatles didn't want to become interested at all to work on George Harrison's own material outside of the Beatles. But I'm not going to talk about a lot about this album, because I am planning to review the Beatles' discography in the new year. But all I could say about the White Album is it is another tremendous record. Obviously elements through sounds of the blues to the avant-garde and musique concrète, where there's folk and acoustic balladry, with some of the band's most beautiful, melodic and personal journey-creating songs, especially when it comes to Lennon and McCartney. And, you know, the whole state of the band was, you know, at the edge of the collapse behind the scenes for the band personally, which we all know about what was going on for the band at this time after the Sgt. Pepper Magical Mystery Tour eras. But the White Album is a tremendous piece of material in different styles for one huge double album classic. At number 8, I have Bob Dylan with Blonde on Blonde. I'm a big Bob Dylan fanatic, and you can see a poster of Robert Allen Zimmerman right here. But Blonde on Blonde, out of all of his albums through his legendary iconic discography, this is one album that is my all-time favourite. I put Blonde on Blonde in here because it's not just that it's known as a Bob Dylan album, but it is one of the most adventurous and mysterious sounding albums, especially through the heavy portrayal of description and imagery in Dylan's lyricism. It's not only just an album that, again, like with Trap-Mask Replica and the White Album, that it is bluesy, but there's beautiful, soulful, and highly intriguing stuff on Blonde that I would define as Dylan's masterpiece. You can't go wrong with tracks like I Want You, Stuck Inside of Mobile with the Memphis Blues again, to Pledging My Time, Sad-Eyed Lady of the Lowlands, and my personal favourite Dylan song of all time being Visions of Johanna. I used to think Like a Rolling Stone is my favourite Dylan song of all time, but it is one of his top best songs ever. But Visions of Johanna is one of those songs that defines an album. And there are loads of songs on here that are glorious and just outstanding stuff. I have been a fan of Dylan's electric period, Bringing It All Back Home, Highway 61 Revisited, and I love some of the other albums from his career before and after, like Freewheeling, Times They Are A-Changing, Time Out of Mind, Love and Theft, World Gone Wrong, Blood on the Tracks, Desire. But for an everlasting long career of Bob Dylan's, for over 60 years, Blonde on Blonde is the crowning achievement in Bob Dylan's discography. At number 7, I have Tago Mago by Can. This one holds a big place for me because I was completely unfamiliar with the experimental difference in the way that art can be completely dive into a lot of musical journeys in separate personalities of experimentalism. And Can was the first krautrock genre band that I have ever listened to. And krautrock is, to me, a really important genre. And as I have been a fan of the other bands like Amandol 2, To Tangerine Dream, Noi, Faust, Guru Guru, and some solo artists making albums in the genre, Can, to me, are my favourite krautrock band. And I know that Kraftwerk is one that I have been a huge fan of, and I still am, but I define them as like the greatest electronic band, but obviously they were previously a krautrock band. But Can, to me, have made the ultimate defining achievement of the genre with this album. As much as that Future Days is another special awarding gem of krautrock music history, that's another one of their best albums. But Tago Mago was completely unexpected for me when I discovered this album. It's one album of theirs that completely grows my musical experiences even further. It is challenging, it is rhythmic, hugely versatile. There's funky pieces, there's rocky pieces, and there's the unorthodox and pretty uncompromising sounds on here. Paper House, Mushroom, Om, Hallelujah, and Oh Yeah. The first half is where the very rhythmic, versatile musicianship sounds happen, but the second half is like a different animal after what you've been listening to from the first half. And that's what I really like a lot about Can's music. Egubam Yassi, Monster Movie, and Soon Over Babaluma, which is one Can album that I've mentioned more than a few times now that I adore. They have been an artistic, unique band, and I see these guys as one of my top, most favourite bands of all time. Tago Mago can be punishing for some listeners. It can be out of control. It can be just mad in its intensity. No matter where the band's going to take you in, Tago Mago is a unique, bold, and variety-driven album. and I adore Tagamago for a lot of these reasons. At number 6, this is one album that will always hold a very special place in my heart, because with many reviews that I've done on this channel, it has got to the point now that the open-mindedness for me to love different genres outside of rock and metal can be really, really consistent. Like what I've mentioned about jazz, ambient, electronic, etc. And at number 6, it's to me one of the greatest debut albums of all time. DJ Shadow's Introducing. I have talked about this album a few times, but I am going to be doing a full album review on this record, so I'm not going to talk about Introducing for very long here. But what I could say about Introducing is it has got to be a different yet dynamic and highly inspiring record for me personally. Trip-hop as a genre is something that I would not have expected myself to be absorbing with. I did like the sound of it when I was younger, but Introducing was like one of those gateway albums. It was like a game changer for many people. There were other outstanding acts in the trip-hop genre already at this time in the 90s, like Portishead, Tricky, Massive Attack, and I think some of Ian Brown's solo stuff can be trip-hop driven, like with Golden Greats, his second album. Introducing is a landmark record, and it can also deliver a sense that this is music that is not only highly sampled in its entirety, but it can be a part of a personality that you feel connected with it. And that is what's so intriguing and as interesting to dive into music like this. Trip-hop is a terrific genre, and it also works to let the music do a sense of direction that you want to go there. DJ Shadow's debut album is one of the perfect debut albums that every time I listen to this, I will never get sick and tired with it. So if you do want to go into Introducing, then I will always recommend this album for anybody. Now we go into the top 5. I would have put Introducing as one of the top 5 albums, but these top 5 here are ones that I love the most, as much as that I love the ones I've talked about so far. Number 5, I have the Rolling Stones' Exile on Main Street. This is not their best album. It is not like a perfectly produced album. It's not even including a lot of the band's best material, but some of their greatest songs of all time are on this album. I'm going to make a video why I think Exile on Main Street is an all-time favourite for me. This is like no other Stones album. And yes, they have experimented previously, like with their Satanic Majesty's Request, which was a very psychedelic-driven album. And they've experimented later on through different production techniques and styles, like some of the 80s stuff, Undercover, for example, and, you know, Emotional Rescue. But Exile on Main Street is like a different beast. And I know I use the word different a lot in this video, but sometimes to use that word more than a few times is exactly the right word. Exile on Main Street is like a personal record, but it does have a bleak atmosphere with it. And it does sound crummy dirty, murky, and, you know, out of reach because the mixing was unbalanced and not as polished, like with Beggar's Banquet and Sticky Fingers and Let It Bleed. And this is one of the rawest, roughest sounding albums the band had created, like what they did on their debut album. Because on the debut album, that was the band at their beginner directions of themselves as a band. And it was their first time creating music and to have a repertoire that was obviously covers, but when they were moving forward to experiment and to adapt as original songwriting geniuses, that's what they continued to do throughout a lot of their albums. And Exile on Main Street is a very, very bleak sounding album. It's got its own distinction of music that is wonderful, beautiful, highly memorable. And even some of the underrated cuts on this album do work out because of its atmosphere. Some of the songs can be, you know, experiencing that they are songs that were written around that time. You know, some of the songs on this album were not written like years prior, although some of them are, but especially where the Stones were at and what they're dealing with around that time, being completely exiled, went over to France, did loads of drugs like heroin and cocaine and tons of partying and the hard addictions. Exile on Main Street is one of these albums that defines the Stones at one of their, in my opinion, one of their ultimate best pieces of music, but they were written at their darkest time. I know they have done loads of things that affected them personally, and this album is one that defines something extremely heartfelt and yet difficult to go through mentally at the time. Number 4, this is one double album that to me is as successful and still is successful for an influence on the guitar for me. So at number 4 is the Jimi Hendrix Experience Electric Ladyland. Electric Ladyland is obviously Hendrix at his best. While Hendrix is my all-time favourite guitarist, this is where his songwriting craft and a lot of his hard graft of non-stop work is at his very top peak as a songwriter and as a lead guitarist. I know that I am a big fan of the Band of Gypsies, the band that was formed after the classic era of the Experience. Like, I'm a huge fanatic of the Band of Gypsies, and that live album is his best for his playing. But Electric Ladyland, through the passion, the creativity, the duration of where Hendrix was going into, and especially to feature great guests, to go into a lot of jams, heavy improvisation, and these musical wonders. Electric Ladyland is a masterclass. It's not only just with the songs, but through production and loads of ideas that were cropping inside Jimmy's head. It's tremendous. You know, Voodoo Child, and even Voodoo Child's Slight Return, his perfect cover of Dylan's track All Along the Watchtower, Gypsy Eyes, 1983, A Moment I Should Not Turn to Be, and everything else around this album, there's no flaw around it. It's psychedelic, it is trippy, it is a separate, magical, mesmerizing journey to behold. There's loads of things that I have talked about previously about this album, and again, I have done a 10-minute review on this album for Classic Albums Revisited, and it's not just one of my most favourite double albums ever, it is one of my most favourite albums of all time. Just like with introducing Exile on Main Street and Tago Mago, and the ones that are in the top 3 coming up. Jimi Hendrix, at his peak with Electric Ladyland, deserved it to be my 4th favourite. And number 3, I love different jazz musicians, like with Charles Mingus, Ornette Coleman, John Coltrane, Herbie Hancock, Chick Corea, and jazz fusion bands like Weather Report, the Mahavishnu Orchestra, and Chick Corea's band Return to Forever. But Miles Davis is my number 1 jazz musician. I could have picked something through the later period that is a double album release. I could have picked a live album. I could have picked anything from live material like Pangaea or Agharta. But in terms of studio albums, my 3rd favourite double album is Miles Davis's Bitches Brew. Bitches Brew was and still is a very confrontational album. This was at a peak of Miles' career where audiences and critics were really slagging him off for moving forward to go into this style of music, because he was a renowned legend through jazz music in modal, post-bop, and the other previous releases. Obviously, like with Milestones, Miles Smiles, Kind of Blue, of course. But when he went into different lineup changes and made albums that shocked many of us and to raise our eyebrows, with albums like Fearless to Kilimanjaro and Miles in the Sky, and the majestic album of his, In a Silent Way, Miles was one of those musicians that did decide to permanently game change himself, switch everything completely, and made him later on an adventurous artist, and that is what I adore about him. There were loads of his albums prior to this jazz fusion era of Miles' career that are wonderful and stunning, but I am a fanatic of the late 60s to 70s stuff, and I am a defender of some of his much later, lesser loved and liked stuff. I love the Tutu album. I enjoyed albums like Amandla and Decoy, and some of the later live albums. Bitches Brew is a monstrous beast of a record. Really long, extended jams. Totally not structured, but it goes so well in massive connections of musicianship. The other musicians who have worked on this album, what a lineup. You know, John McLaughlin, Jack DeJohnette, Herbie Hancock, and the rest of the entourage. It's insane to me that this album was recorded 55 years ago, and then a year later, or obviously less than a year later to make it correct, Bitches Brew was out. This was material that was recorded in the same sessions, or closely, as with Fearless to Kilimanjaro and In a Silent Way. Bitches Brew is wild, crazy, and it is pretty pulverizing because there was a lot of moments where it does sound, in your face, but the way Miles delivered and the rest of the band, Miles gives the band the orders, like to create a beat, make a bass line, make a drum beat, and whenever a structure comes to life through anything that comes up in their heads, it matches everything into this creative tour de force. And it's not just about the music that I love the most. The album cover perfectly fits in that experience. Bitches Brew is a double album that I would not stop think about it and to listen to it. It amazes me to this very day. I could go on about a lot of Miles Davis's albums, and Bitches Brew is, to me, a single double album pick that I would not recommend for any beginner for Miles Davis, for ones who want to get into him. I want a lot of listeners to get into the earlier stuff first, and then be really interested to explore their musical listenings to go forward after the previous stuff. Bitches Brew really is, something else. It's one album that I can't put into words still, because it's full of describing, and there's loads of words to really think about that album. Miles Davis with his very strong masterpiece, that is Bitches Brew, is at number 3. Number 2, now this album was released as a double album in the later reissues, but I believe the album was released with 3 sides of music that was pressed to vinyl when it came out, and I think side 4 was just an etching look. But I'm going to count this one as a double album because it's over an hour long, but it's just 70 minutes of some of the wildest albums that I did discover before I turned 18 years old. This one is extremely nostalgic for me. My best friend for over 20 years, Callum, was the person who got me introduced to this band. This is one band that I love very, very much, who are another top favourite band of all time. So number 2, with my favourite album from this band's brief discography, is Mr. Bungle's self-titled debut album. Many Mr. Bungle fanatics would pick California as their favourite, and I can understand why. This is a band, like with Captain Beefheart and his Magic Band, to Frank Zappa and his band, The Mothers of Invention, to, Naked City and Cardiacs, and any other band that is so maddening and artistic and very special, because Mr. Bungle was actually the very first time band that I thought there was no band that could create material like this. Mr. Bungle's debut album is funny. It's just insanity in many ideas in one. Different styles, metal, experimental, prog, funk, and sampled pieces, and it is provocative, it is sexual, humorous, and, you know, I'm always finding many words to think about this album. It's a freak out for crazy people to love this album. The very first track that got me introduced to Mr. Bungle was on this album, and that song is My Ass Is On Fire. My Ass Is On Fire just won me over, and it is one of my top 10 favourite songs of all time. It's a moment in my time as a music listener that I thought I was just going to laugh at a track like this, because it was unexpected. It was totally a non-usual song that I have heard. You know, Mike Patton is always a genius, and along with the other musicians around this time and the later era of Mr. Bungle, they're just one of the greatest bands of all time. My Ass Is On Fire to The Girls of Porn and Dead Goon, Love Is a Fist, Quote Unquote, Slowly Growing Deaf, Carousel. You know, when I reviewed this album, I had a blast, and this album still is as a blast to listen to. You know, I could really go on about this self-titled Mr. Bungle album for a really long time. And Disco Volante is another one. That album is something like this album, but Disco Volante is where the most daring and uncomfortable and just, you know, unsettling pieces of musical variety still amazes me that some people may like it, or they just think, what the fuck is this? I can't stand this. I can't listen to this. I'm not ready for this. And that's what's incredible about Mr. Bungle. I know they're returned for more than a few years now with a different lineup in their crossover thrashy period, like with the Raging Wrath of the Easter Bunny, which I really liked that album. I thought it was awesome. But Mr. Bungle's debut album is a quintessential album that really hits home for me because of the nostalgia, the reflections I had with it for the first time I have listened to it. And I will always, always admire this band very, very fondly. Number 1, my favourite double album of all time. It is a concept album that is a really, really special one. This is one album that made me a fan of this band, and I am going to review this classic band's discography in the new year. I have mentioned about this album previously for those who have seen my question video of what is your favourite double album. This album is always my number 1. Number 1 is The Who Quadrophenia. I have mentioned Tommy as one of the honourable mentions, but Quadrophenia is outstanding. It is striking. It is powerful. It is as a versatile record. I say versatile not on the concept, but to know that The Who have really made something as like a life-changing product of music history. I love the other albums like The Who Sell Out, the aforementioned Tommy, Who's Next, which for many Who fans, they see that one as their favourite and the best one. I'm a big defender and fan of The Who by Numbers, and I did enjoy some of It's Hard and Endless Wire. You know, The Who's discography is just as influential and iconic, like with the other very obvious ones. But Quadrophenia is the Who at their very top, best ever peak for me, in a personal way. I grew my attachment to this band after this album. I did like the sound of the Who, but when I was watching their 90s full performance of the band playing Quadrophenia in its entirety, I couldn't believe it. I could not put it into words. From the moment I listened to this album and fell in love with it, straight away to this very day, I still really want to talk about this album for an extremely long time. And I am planning to do that, because this is not only just a concept album, it's a part of British culture. It's a part of the mod history, and especially for Pete Townshend's own take, with a musician like him, as well as the other members of the Who were there as a part of the mod culture, the whole society in Britannia, to, you know, the other scenes, like with Beatlemania and the hippie movements and the variety of genres, blues, psychedelia and folk, to musical parody, the avant-garde, and many other pieces of music history. But Quadrophenia was one of those albums that still hits me right in the feels. It's as a personal record, and I never would think about putting any other double album and concept album to be at the #1 spot than this one. The Who's Quadrophenia is my most favourite double album and concept album of all time ever. That's it, guys. That is my list of my top 10 favourite double albums of all time. I know what I said earlier, this video had to be so raw and unedited. I hope I've done this video as good enough to talk about these albums in many different words. But thank you guys very much for watching this video. Let me know what your favourite double albums of all time are in the comments down below. And as always, I will keep you guys posted for more videos in the near future.